Right, welcome everybody. I hope I've now allowed the people who are joining us online to see and hear us. Massive welcome to this really exciting afternoon of all matters cross-national surveys. I'm really delighted to be here on behalf of the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, to celebrate 20 years of the European Social Survey, a study that we've supported since its outset. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alison Park. I'm the Deputy Executive Chair of the ESRC, and within my portfolio sit all of our wonderful data infrastructures, of which these surveys are a sort of really flagship part. I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction before introducing our speakers and then handing over to them. So firstly, for those of you who aren't familiar with ESS, with the European Social Survey, it's an academically driven cross-national study that measures attitudes, values and behaviours over 30 countries, with 40,000 interviews taking place every 2 years. And today is a really fantastic opportunity to celebrate ESS and its 20th year of data collection, but also to appreciate the value and the importance of cross-national studies more generally. We'll hear from 3 other studies today, and I'll say a little bit more about them in a moment, but they all differ in important ways. So some cover a different geographical area to the European Social Surveys. Others have a more specific topic area that they focus on than ESS, but all of them share a really critical feature, which is in their cross-national element. And that's the value that I think these studies really bring to the surveys that ESRC supports, because with that cross-national element, you're able to look at how one country differs or is the same against this much bigger backdrop of what's happening cross-nationally. And whether you're doing that at a single point in time or over a long time period, that brings you huge insight into what's happening in that country, why that might be happening, and indeed what the sort of policy solutions or others might be. So in terms of today's format, we're going to hear from our 4 speakers in turn. Each of them are going to focus on a different cross-national study and tell you a little bit about that study and some of the key research that they've done using it. We'll have time after each speaker for a very short Q&A based on what they've been saying. And then at the end, we'll have a panel discussion where we'll hear from all 4 speakers together and myself. And we're going to be focused on the question of how can we unlock even more value from key international resources like the surveys that we've been speaking about. And there'll be a chance for audience questions at that point as well. So I will now introduce each of our speakers in turn. So we're going to hear first from Professor Rory Fitzgerald. Rory became director of the European Social Survey in 2013, having worked on the study since its conception. Rory is the first director of the ESS ERIC, the European Research Infrastructure Consortium, and he oversees the ESS Core Scientific Team and the ESS National Coordinators Forum. And Rory is obviously going to be talking to you about the European Social Survey and some of the fantastic work that it's doing, both methodologically and in terms of research findings. We'll then turn to Bobby Duffy, who is Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London. Bobby's worked across a vast array of public policy areas in his career of 30 years in policy research and evaluation, including being seconded to the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. And I think particularly importantly for today, he also has a very significant career working in the survey research industry, from his time when he was in a very senior role at Ipsos Mori. We'll then have a short break, which will allow you to grab a cup of tea or something from outside, and then we'll hear from Brianna Pirelli-Harris, who is a professor of demography at the University of Southampton. Brianna is leading the UK work on the Generations and Gender Survey. She also is Associate Editor for Population Studies, and is on the scientific board for the UK Household Longitudinal Survey, or Understanding Society, as you will also know it. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Natalie Maplethorpe. Natalie is a research director in NatSen's Household Surveys team, and she currently leads the European Social Survey work on behalf of NatSen. Natalie has had 2 stints at NatSen. She returned in 2021 following some time working for M&C, Saatchi World Services and Plan International. And Natalie's going to be talking about the International Social Survey Programme, which is the 4th study we're going to be hearing about. I should have checked whether there's any housekeeping that I need to tell people about. I assume there's no planned fire alarms. If there is a fire alarm, we... Okay.
Fire alarm. There's a fire exit.
Okay. Okay, so we will go out to the right if there is a fire alarm. Brilliant. So on that note, I will pass over to Rory. Over to you.
There we go. Good afternoon, and Alison, thank you very much for the warm words of introduction. 20 years of ESS. One thing that wasn't quite right, I actually joined ESS at the beginning of the second round, not at the very beginning. So I'm not responsible for the core question. But it's been a long time and a long journey. So it's a very special occasion for us in the ESS team here at City University, which is our host institution. We're here today in their premises. So thank you to them for their support for ESS. And also special thanks to the ESRC, because their really supportive role for cross-national research in general, and particularly for the ESS, has been fundamental for its success. It simply wouldn't be possible for that. And as a result of that, the UK is really seen as a leader in cross-national research. So many thanks to ESRC for their support over more than 20 years now. So 20 years of the ESS. Just to say a little bit about the aims of the ESS. So the ESS is an infrastructure now, not just a survey project. So we have a broad set of aims, and our role, particularly for the team here at the headquarters of the ESS, is to provide that overall infrastructure. So we're serving the needs of researchers all across Europe and actually beyond Europe, so that they can have high quality data. So we're aiming to operate that research infrastructure so that people can look at change and stability over time between European countries. And we're aiming to do that with the highest standards in cross-national comparative research. And I'll say a little bit more about why that is in a moment. To continue to do methodological research and innovation, I'll actually talk a little bit about some of our most recent methodological research today. And we also aim to facilitate training, particularly in use of ESS data, and ensure the visibility and outreach of ESS data amongst researchers, but also beyond to policymakers, the general public, and the third sector. So back in the 1990s, there were German social scientists in particular, political scientists, but also others who were trying to do high quality comparative research using data from existing cross-national surveys and other sources. And they kept getting frustrated that when they tried to make comparisons, there were too many differences in how the surveys were being conducted in each country. And they would then have difficulties drawing robust conclusions. So perhaps the translations weren't really equivalent, or really the sample sizes or the actual number of cases were the same. The effective sample size was very different between countries, or the data was labeled and made available in different ways. And so those researchers came together through the European Science Foundation, which is that time was a research council's umbrella organization, and made the case to produce a cross-national input harmonized survey. And that's come about. And that was a great coming together of minds and an acceptance from researchers in different countries that they would agree to do things differently from how they would normally do them, and that they would make input harmonization at the core of quality, so that end users could be confident that they are basing their results on truly comparative data. The ESS itself has been recognised at the European level. It's on the ESRC, European Strategy Forum for Research Infrastructures in Europe roadmap. And crucially, in 2013, it became a European Research Infrastructure Consortium, the first in the United Kingdom. And that means the organisation is now owned essentially by 28 national governments across Europe, and they provide a core budget for the operations of the ESS. And the UK, represented by the ESRC, is the host country. So that's a little bit about the background of the project. A little bit about the overview. So it's academically led. We've completed 10 rounds of data collection. The 11th round is now drawing to a close, and the first data release for that will be later this month. From the start, it's been based upon face-to-face data collection in all countries. Self-completion methods have started to become a part of our RI, and I'll talk more about that later today. Crucially as well, data from the ESS was always supposed to be made available to everyone at the same time. So it's a public good, it's open science. We don't get to write our papers with the data before everyone else gets the data, nor is the people working with us on designing the modules. Everything is released simultaneously for free and open use. And there's been significant use of the infrastructure as well. I'll come back to that again a little bit later. Projects coordinated by a core scientific team of 7 institutions plus the headquarters across Europe. The other UK institution involved is the University of Essex, where Peter Lynn runs the sampling and weighting expert panel. But this group of institutions coordinates the project centrally. And then in each of the participating countries, there's a national coordinator whose responsibility is to implement the survey according to our single specification. And in the UK, since round 1, it's been National Centre for Social Research, who's been the organisation providing a national coordinator. Alison was actually the national coordinator in earlier years. And Alan Humphrey, who can't be here in person today, I know, is online, is also now the current national coordinator. But each country would have their own national coordinator responsible for operating the survey. In the early rounds of ESS, the participation fluctuated because each country had to kind of raise money, go out, apply for that. We were also always applying for centralised money to run the operation. But now we've become a European Research Infrastructure Consortium. The 28 countries that are now members have started to participate on a kind of regular and consistent basis. Russia were involved in earlier years, but cooperation with Russia is suspended at the moment. But Ukraine are part of the infrastructure, and actually fieldwork is currently underway in government-controlled areas of Ukraine through some special support, again, from ESRC. In addition to providing substantive data, the ESS was set up to provide that in a way that was based upon the best practices in cross-national research, and also to further develop them. I'm not going to go through every one of these areas. We don't have time today, but the core scientific team of the ESS has really focused on trying to implement an input harmonized solution to how the infrastructure is run, whether that's through equivalent but not identical sampling designs in every country that achieve the same effective sample size using probability methods everywhere, or whether it's from the translation approach that was being produced that really looked back at the past and really solved lots of quality problems with translations in social surveys cross-nationally, and really got to grips with that with a new committee approach, so that users could be more reassured that the questions were really asked in an equivalent way between countries. So in all of the areas on this screen, the ESS has tried to promote quality, including in its open access and well-documented data. Questionnaire itself has 2 parts. It's been about an hour-long instrument to date, at least in the UK. Sometimes in certain languages it's a bit shorter or a bit faster. The core questionnaire has broadly stayed the same since the first round in 2002, when the questionnaire has been repeated every 2 years. However, there has been a few changes to update things over time, but most of it has stayed broadly the same. And here we really cover some of the core dimensions that social scientists identified back in 2000 that were crucial to measure in a cross-national project like ESS. And that includes human values, really detailed demographic data about highest level of education and occupation, core topics like trust in politics, immigration, subjective well-being, and so forth. So that stayed broadly the same. And actually, data users, this is the area of the question that gets the most use. They like this kind of stability over time, and that's well received. In addition to that, we have an open competition every 2 years where we open part of the questionnaire up to cross-national teams across Europe to bid to develop part of the ESS questionnaire. And that's really, again, underlining that the ESS is an infrastructure. It's open to others to influence. It's not just a closed team of people producing that data. And some of those topics have then been repeated. So, for example, the immigration module was included in the first round, the 7th round, and will be repeated in our 12th round. The other thing to say is our 11th round data shortly to be released. That includes a new module on gender in contemporary Europe, rethinking equality in the backlash, and also a repeat module on social inequalities in health and their determinants. And many UK academics have been part of developing these modules. For example, on the gender module, Susan Banducci at University of Exeter is involved, and on the immigration module, it's been led by Professor Anthony Heath at Oxford. So there's been a good interest from the UK academic community in developing some of these modules. As an infrastructure, a key thing for us is how many people are using the data. So to access the data, you visit our website, you give a short amount of information, including your email address, where you're located, your kind of academic or other activity, and then you immediately get access to the data. It's free and immediate, there's no restrictions. And since we first started making that data available, over 234,000 email addresses have been entered to gain access. And 70% of those are students, so it's very well used by the student population, both individual students, but also in teaching and so forth. 74% of our users have actually downloaded the data. And just taking 1 year, for example, 2020, there were 7,712 active non-student users of the ESS data. So non-students who logged in and downloaded the data at least once. So we're aware that there aren't 234,000 users all the time. In about a year, there's about just over 7,000. And many of those users have gone on to use the data to publish. There's just over 6,500 ESS publications in the English language. And we can see that there are 294 methodological articles and 3,437 substantive ones. And we can see an increasing number of journal articles. In 2022, for example, there were 387. So significant use of the data and the significant publications arising from the data set. ESS also appears in the media. So our media officer at ESS HQ monitors the number of mentions of European Social Survey in media across Europe, but also beyond. And the 2022 to 23 media monitoring report, there were just over 1,000 mentions of European Social Survey. We've also more recently been looking at policy use of ESS data. So we commissioned the EFIS Centre to look at the use of ESS data, particularly at the European Union level in terms of policy, but also other areas. And here we found significant mentions of ESS data. So they found references in over 3,000 policy documents across 57 countries, including government, think tanks, and international organizations. And this was the breakdown by country, the number of mentions in different countries. And I can also tell you that there were 392 policy references found in EU documents, and actually 202 in UK government documents as well. So there is interest and use of ESS data in policy documents. Quickly, in terms of selected findings, I'm just going to give two brief examples. The first is to do with trust in institutions, which is something which has been in the core questionnaire of ESS since 2002 and repeated in every round since. Well, I'm just going to take the data from our 10th round, our most recent round. And what I want to show here is, whilst there are differences in the kind of mean levels of trust in different organizations across Europe, the pattern, the hierarchy between the different institutions is broadly the same. So we do see quite big differences in the trust in institutions, particularly some countries in former Central and Eastern Europe where the levels of trust are much lower. But here you can see the levels for trust in the police, the mean score on an 11-point scale. And then we move on to trust in the legal system. And you can see that that's the next highest in almost all countries, followed by trust in parliament. And last and definitely least is trust in the politicians. And what we see here is, although the levels are different, the pattern is consistent. So in the UK, trust in the police was a mean score of 6.3, the legal system 5.8, parliament 4.19, and politicians 3.38. And just one other example in terms of use of the data is looking at attitudes towards climate change. And the reason I wanted to show this particular piece of data is it shows quite significant change between rounds. What we generally have found in the ESS is a lot of stability over time in social attitudes and beliefs, and not large changes over time. But here we see between our 8th round and then when we repeated some questions in the 10th round about the personal responsibility to reduce climate change. And here we saw big increases in most countries, particularly those perhaps where the mean score had been lower in our previous round. What I wanted to do in the final part of my talk was look towards the next 20 years, and particularly to focus a little bit on methodology. So when the ESS was first set up in 2002, there was a big discussion about whether to use different modes of data collection. And it was decided very much that it should be based upon face-to-face interviewing in all countries, because that was the gold standard. That was the single approach that really could be implemented well in all countries at the same time. So there was a big decision to focus mostly the main data collection on face-to-face, but to do some experimentation over time. And over most of those 20 years, there was a kind of naturally built-in conservatism, I guess, to stick with that approach to maintain the time series. And then COVID came along, and COVID caused some significant disruption. We were unable to do face-to-face interviewing in some of the countries. And where we did do it, it was very disrupted. So we trialed a self-completion approach in some of those countries, following some initial piloting in some countries during the pandemic, and then we rolled it out to be allowed to be used for the main stage data collection. So that pushed us, I think, to look more at this area. And that was good, because actually what's happening in a lot of countries over Europe is face-to-face interviewing capacity is contracting, becoming very difficult in some countries to do face-to-face interviewing. And where it is still available, it's becoming more expensive. So for the ESS, I think we could see the direction of travel. And because our questionnaire is relatively straightforward, it can actually be implemented on a paper self-completion document as well as in computer-assisted ways. So we made the decision to switch. Our 11th round that's just finishing will use face-to-face fieldwork in all countries. And then in our 12th round, countries are going to do a 50-50 split between face-to-face and self-completion. So we will be able to help our users to bridge a change from face-to-face to self-completion by having that 50-50 split in our 12th round. And in our 13th round, we will move fully to web self-completion. So I just wanted to give a little bit of information about how that's going. So on this chart here, you can see some initial information about response rates that we're getting for the ESS self-completion approach. In some countries, we already knew that it was going to go quite well, like Germany had been pushing to move to self-completion for some time with successful implementation. We knew in general that there were other surveys, for example, in the UK, that had switched to self-completion or had used self-completion well. But in other countries, some of the stuff that ESS was doing, it was the first time for a long time anyone had done self-completion surveys using probability methods in those countries. And what we're seeing here is that where countries follow our protocol, response rates tend to be between 30 and 40%. That means they're much more similar between countries. In face-to-face, in the 10th round, they varied between 20% and 70%. Now they're much closer together. And this is based on a long questionnaire, around 50 to 60 minutes for people to fill in self-completion. And they are doing that despite some earlier concerns about that. We did some experimentation before we rolled this out, and we were pleased by that. So we're very pleased with how that's been going. And particularly, I wanted to give a bit of information on how it's gone in Great Britain. So this Great Britain, Northern Ireland were not included in this particular experiment. This was another experiment funded by ESRC. And actually, one of the other collaborators with this project is in the room, Nick Moon. We wanted to compare how ESS data collection was going in the 10th round. So the 10th round face-to-face was going on. And then we commissioned separately a self-completion experiment with the same questionnaire. So we used the same sample frame, post office address file. We used different agencies in this case. We had a self-completion protocol where we sent an invitation asking people to do it online, 2 reminders, the last one with a paper questionnaire. And a little bit later, we left it a while and then did a kind of relaunch. We used unconditional incentives. We're both using the face-to-face and self-completion approach. But in the self-completion approach, we put cash in the envelope. And we used conditional incentives in the self-completion part. They were at interviewer discretion in the face-to-face. This table here shows the response rates. And it shows them by the conditional incentive type, which you can see over on the far side there. And these are the response rates before we've taken account really of the ineligible. So in self-completion, you don't really know what the ineligible cases are because you haven't been there to find out the address doesn't exist or something like that. So you don't really know what the eligibility rate would have been. And here you can see the response rates range from 33.9 to 39.2. And then when we compared those response rates to the face-to-face, but here we'd accounted for the adjusted eligibility, you could see that with a £10 conditional incentive, we were able to get a 43% response rate to a 50-minute questionnaire in about 2 months. Meanwhile, coming out of COVID, to be fair, still face-to-face was particularly struggling in the UK at that time, with a response rate in the low 20s, and the fieldwork took a year or so. So we can see some quite big differences here. And I think this is really promising for the future, both in the UK, but also elsewhere, that we can do a lot with this self-completion approach, surveys without interviewers to improve the future. These shows the unweighted comparisons in terms of shares between the self-completion ESS and the face-to-face ESS. Again, we can see very few differences here. The only significant one, I think, was to do with years of education. So the sample composition is not particularly different between these two approaches. A bit of a long quote here, but I wanted to put this up to show some other work that we've been doing in ESS. So I mentioned that quite a lot of countries had switched from face-to-face to self-completion in the 10th round. We compared those countries over time to the countries that had stuck with face-to-face. And we looked at likely differences in the data. And what we really found was that the underlying structure of the data, the correlations, remained very, very similar, even when there was a mode change. But what you do find on some ESS items is a change in the mean scores and the point estimates. But for a lot of our users, that's quite reassuring because they mostly do model-based data analysis. So that's for the future, very exciting, but also quite a big undertaking to move 30 countries to self-completion. Lastly, this is my final slide, accessing the ESS data. I think one of the reasons ESS has been sort of successful with getting users to use its data is A, that it's freely available, but also that it's so well labeled and so clear to use. And that's kind of a lot of feedback we get from our users. So you can download it. You can also analyze it online. You can now analyze it online and do crosstabs and get mean scores, and that is then automatically weighted. So there are two main ways to access the data and some access to other things. So it's been an exciting 20 years, exciting times to come. Thank you to all those who've used our data. Thank you to those who've collected it. And thank you to those who've funded it. Thank you.
I didn't stay up.
Questions now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So we've got a few minutes now for Q&A about ESS and Rory's presentation. So I'll open to the floor. So I've got Nick first, and then Alan.
What the hell were you doing in January 2023 to get on that huge jump in mentions? You must have done something very exciting.
I think there was some data about EU referendums was released, and most of that was there was a lot of interest in the UK, but also elsewhere. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Interested in the here and now. Very interested in the future and move to a different mode of data collection. But I'm also interested in the here and now, particularly around 11. It's still all face to face. I just wondered if you could say a bit about the kind of difficulties that you've encountered during face to face field work, which we hear an awful lot about. I'm interested in your kind of take on that and where it's been most difficult across your 22 or so countries, and what the challenges have been. But give an insight into where the difficulties have been most protracted.
Yeah. So the data collection has recovered somewhat since COVID. So I think the final response rates are going to be released in a few weeks' time, but in the UK, it's nudging back up closer to 30%. But still, of course, a lot lower than the self-completion one I presented. So there has been an improvement. What's happening in most countries is there's been a smaller number of interviewers now who are being relied on to do a lot of the interviewing. And that, of course, is again a concern because particularly for attitudinal surveys, there's quite a lot of evidence there can be a lot of interviewer effects in the data. I think where we're for the in terms of the here and now and how you kind of take that forward, I guess is what kind of investment is there going to be in securing face-to-face data collection. I mean, it's not impossible to still do it. It's just having the staff on the ground who are well trained and committed to continue to do that. The main problem hasn't been increased refusals, although that's part of it. The main problem has been simply a lack of capacity. And we're seeing in some countries, Sweden, for example, would be one of the examples where it's been extremely difficult for them in the last round, simply weren't able to visit all of the addresses in the end. The provider in Finland, for example, has said we will not do face-to-face ESS again, that would no longer be available. And one country got 0 bids for the first time to do ESS face-to-face, and that wasn't anywhere that you'd expect. It was Czechia, and they have actually had to do ESS using self-completion methods. So it's no longer only in Scandinavia that there are these challenges. It's gone broader than that. In Spain, our partner that used to do in-house face-to-face has stopped. They've had to go outside to get another partner. So it's getting very difficult. But I think the key is the capacity. And relying on fewer interviewers is not a good strategy, I think, for the future.
Great, thank you, Rory. Any, yes.
That was fascinating. I was really interested in the incentives, thinking like what £5 or £10 or €5 to €10 means, and whether that means a higher return rate for economic groups, whether that matches population levels, and to get a response to how time, energy, or means to spend out. Does it not matter? It matches populations.
Certainly the conditional incentive in particular helps to bring in underrepresented groups. So one of them that worked with in quite a lot of countries has been people who weren't born in the country. They tend to respond more if there's a higher conditional incentive. So there is some evidence of that, but most of the countries we've had haven't really yet drilled down into the differential impacts of the incentives. That would be a good thing for them to ask us to do in the next phase. It's mostly been at the moment about improving the overall operation of the project.
Brilliant. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Rory. Can I just check? Are we happy with the air conditioning and the people who are listening online?
Yeah,
It's so when questions are being asked on the floor, we'll repeat them so that everyone can hear. Okay, that's absolutely fine. So I'm delighted now to introduce Bobby Duffy. Bobby is going to talk to us about the World Values Survey, which is another excellent example of a cross-national study, but with a bigger geographic area of focus. And he's going to focus on understanding how our values are shifting, how we fit in with an increasingly complex world, and whether we're coming together or drifting apart within identity groups in the UK and between the UK nations. So over to you, Bobby.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you for the invitation. Great to see so many people here. Just before I go into mine, just to say, just to echo those points about ESS being an incredibly valuable resource. We've used it so much, including all of my work on generations has got so much ESS data running through it. And it's because it's got those long-term trends, it's just going to get increasingly valuable. The value just increases over time. So it's great to have these series to run through. So I'm going to talk about UK in the World Values Study. And World Values Survey is very big in, I think, 4 important ways. First of all, it's got really long-term trends back to 1981, which gives that sense of value of really understanding how the world has changed. It covers over 110 countries in its history, and it's increasing over time. So it was 85 countries in the most recent wave. And then it's very similar in size actually to ESS. It's over 290 questions with some facility to add your own at the end. And then fourth and final way is it is the most cited social survey, partly because of that longevity and country coverage. It's got incredible profile in academic and other places around the world. So we did, I'm not going to focus as much on methodology as Rory did so brilliantly, but we did a big random probability survey in the UK too, following a model that David Vos used for the European Values Survey in 2018. So 3,600 random probability interviews in the UK, including boosts in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which I'll come back to some of the reasons for that in a second. And one of the most important part of this, actually, the kind of presentation overall, is this is the first time that the UK was a full participant in WVS in over 15 years. So a lot of our focus has been on re-raising the profile of World Value Survey in the UK. And we've done that through a thematic focus on really 3 key themes: the UK in the world, how do we fit in, whether we're polarizing across the UK as a whole, and then a big focus on the UK nations, because that was a big interest to some of our funders. So we put together a big team for this. A brilliant team at King's, including James, who's here in the audience, but also trying to bring in people from a policy perspective. Behavioural Insights team, David Halpin, being incredibly useful in this, and then someone embedded in Northern Ireland, because that was a crucial aspect of that social change initiative, and drawing on David Vos's expertise from UCL to make sure. Ah. Don't worry. found to be something I did wrong.
I also find it.
So yeah. Yeah, I can do that. Don't worry. Thanks. Thank you. No, it's no doubt my fault. And then brilliant support too from the World Value Survey Association, who do the national international coordination, and Ipsos were great fieldwork partners. And I have to say, obviously, particular thanks to ESRC, who were the main funder for this. And they did something very interesting when they gave us the money. They said, you can have this for the core, but then you have to fundraise for the national boosts, which was made for, they told us that in November, December, and then we had to raise the money for the boost by January. So it was a really interesting Christmas for me and the team, but it was incredibly helpful because what it led to was us doing really quick engagement with key government clients. So we got most of our additional funding from the Cabinet Office, who've got huge interests in the direction of the UK nations, but also the Northern Ireland Office, and then British Academy, Barrow Cadbury Trust, JRCT, Community Foundation, Unbound Flag, all came together. And the benefit of this was they were then invested in the study. So they were really interested in the results and making sure it was a success, but they'd also leveraged a much bigger investment from ESRC so they could make the case very clearly to their internal audiences. The second thing that was kind of different about this that I think is worth emphasizing is that I'm the PI for this as a project within from the open call. Now we're part of the infrastructures team and with the directors within that. But it meant that we also had some time to do our own publicity and press releasing and engagement around this that was built into the model. So what we did with that was take a model that we use very much in all of our other work, where we're doing programmatic work on particular themes, and not put it all out. We put all of the data out immediately, but did our own analysis in a thematic basis, splitting it into 9 different survey releases, which look like this, picking out particular thematic areas, doing a press release and a very accessible PowerPoint pack, and sending them out to the media and policy audiences on everything from liberalization to trust in neighbors to faith, belief and faith, and what we want for our kids. All of those are available on the website with nice interactive graphs and those types of things. And that was very effective in raising the media profile, but also engaging directly with policymakers. So we had similar sorts of levels of media coverage over a short period of time for the study when we got these releases out. Over 1,000, is approaching 2,000 now when you add it all up across the different media sources. And like I say, it wasn't just for the fame of these media releases, it was to draw people towards us who didn't know about the World Value Survey. And that's been very effective. And we've had a whole program of policy labs, as we call them, which I'll come back to at the end, and then just tailored engagement with different government departments and bodies. So this one's from EHRC, who are saying how the analysis has helped, alongside their equality and human rights ones, has helped them shape their approach to delivering their statutory duty to foster good relations in Great Britain, and kind of understanding the value and importance of these sorts of data in those core government aims is a key aspect of the study overall. We're trying to learn what works for policy audiences in actual use of these data. So I just wanted to run you through what 3 of the key themes were from the study as far as we saw it, and the way it was picked up in the media and by policy colleagues. And the first is that the UK public stand out as being among the most tolerant nations across these different studies, across these different countries, and over time, with large shifts in recent decades. And just to pick out a couple of examples of that, this is a question on the percentage of people that say a behavior or characteristic is morally justifiable. And you can see incredible shifts in views of homosexuality, but lots of other things too. Abortion, divorce, euthanasia is an interesting one, which we can dig into, which we're digging into more, and casual sex. So there's a couple of things that stand out from this. First of all, just how different we were in the 1980s, incredibly different sort of country. And you do forget that when you don't have those long-term trends. But having the long-term trends also points out the second thing, which is most of this change has come in the last 10, 12, 15 years. This has been an accelerating trend over a relatively recent period, which gives you some idea of maybe some of the polarizing tensions that we've got. And just on a similar sort of theme, we also have, the UK also has high levels of social trust in other people of different sorts. So it asks, WBS asks this in a number of different ways. So if you're looking at people, trust in people you know, we're 98% of people say that. We're kind of second out of a 24 country set that we picked out to do most of our comparisons on. 54% say they trust people they meet for the first time, which is third in the rank order of that. But then 86% say they trust people of another nationality, which is actually top out of the 24 countries. We're the most likely to say we trust people of another nationality. And 85% say they trust people of another religion. And again, this got a lot of attention when we released it, with people being surprised that we were so relatively tolerant and trusting. And there was a couple of more negative takes on that, like Adam Evans. There's always a negative spin you can put on things, but it's a really good illustrative point of how understanding where we fit in the world gives us a different perception of ourselves, and that's really important to keep that sorts of things in context. But the big theme, in many ways, from this change is that when we look across countries and continents, and we created a simple social liberal index measure and looked at that across all the countries that we could go back to 1981 on. This is the sort of pattern you get with where those lines are the different continents that we have around the world. And the main feature that this shows, this type of long-term trend shows, is how we are diverging globally in terms of our views of these types of things. We may have the impression that people are coming together in a more socially liberal world, but if you look at the range at the beginning of this series to the end of this series, what we're actually seeing is a world that's pulling apart in terms of its views. A lot more liberalization in some regions, but none at all in other regions on these types of measures. And I think this is a really important trend for us to pick up on, which I'll come back to right at the end. Second point I wanted to make is the UK public also expressed continued support for democracy in principle, which again runs against some of the narrative that you will see when we're discussing democracy in the UK. So when you ask people what types of democratic system are very or fairly good ways of governing the country, when you ask about democratic political systems, these are the trends that you get in the UK. Increase in very or fairly good, which is driven mostly by the percentage increase in very good, from 41 up to 64%. So we are not rejecting democracy in principle. There's also little sign of an authoritarian reflex, as Pippa Norris and others would call it, in terms of interest in a strong leader who doesn't bother with parliament or elections. We come right near the bottom of lists like this, tables like this, with 26% of people saying that. But then again, the second thing that stands out from this chart is just how much interest there is in that in other countries around the world. Incredibly different perspectives and preferences in different sorts of regions. And worse than that, while it's flat in Britain, we've always been about 20 to 25% of people saying that they're interested in this. There's big increases in places like Africa, some places within Asia and the Americas too, including the US. There has been a significant increase there too. So again, this point of where are we, but also where are we relative to others, and how are those changing and pulling in different directions, which does add to global tensions. And the third and final point I wanted to make is that all seems quite rosy from a UK perspective. We quite like each other. We like the principle of democracy, but it's not all good news, unfortunately. While we have got those positives, we are losing confidence in some key institutions, which kind of echoes some of the things that Rory was saying. And the really important point here is this is not a new crisis of trust in institutions. When you look at the trends on things like trust in the press, trust in the police, and trust in Parliament, they are long-term declines that we've seen from 87% for the police down to 67% now, driven very much by Gen Z, which we discussed at another NatCen event, and that is a real concern about Gen Z's relationship with the police. Parliament, trust in Parliament has halved, nearly 41% down to 23%. And trust in the press was 30% back in 1981, 13% now. It's more or less reached rock bottom for decades. Second from bottom only to Egypt, which is not a good position to be in if you know anything about Egyptian media and how that is rated. But the key point here is this is not new. But the trouble with that in some ways is we may be used to it, but it's also not the norm across different countries. There is a wide variety in levels of confidence in key institutions like the government, Parliament, and political parties in different countries around the world, where the UK or Great Britain is in the bottom half of each of those types of measures. The thing that stands out, obviously, immediately is that China are doing quite well on these types of measures, which does raise a sort of a Nora O'Neill trustworthiness versus trust type debate about what level of trust you think is credible and right. But I think we can agree that we should be aiming for somewhere more like Germany or Sweden or Canada in terms of our levels of trust rather than where we are right now. So I just want to finish with talking about the next step in this. One of the tools that we use is something called policy labs, where we get policymakers together with researchers, together with media, and we have a day and lots of pre-briefing and then a structured workshop day and then a policy brief that comes out of it. And we've got 3 of those around where are we in the world and what do values data tell us about international policy decision-making. We've got the next one is on polarization, which I'll say a bit about in a second. And then the third one is going to be on the UK nations and whether we're coming apart altogether as a country. And so this is going to be the focus for our upcoming lab. And I'm going to just show you one quick slide from it. And it's really important because there's so much US exceptionalism and so much US driving of our narrative of what's happening to our politics and polarization. It's really important to keep repeating the message that the UK is not the US. It's really useful to keep that in mind. So just one simple chart that shows that is we just plot across that social liberal index, social attitudes, just as a histogram, a distribution, splitting Republicans and Democrats into different colors with traditional attitudes at one end, liberal attitudes at the other end. And this is the sort of pattern that you saw in 1990 in the US, where there was virtually no difference between Republicans and Democrats on their social attitudes. You couldn't really predict a social attitude based on whether someone was a Republican or a Democrat. But you fast forward to 2017, which was the last time that US was included in these data. And that's the pattern that you see now for Republicans and Democrats. So Pew call this a moving mountain chart because you can just see the mountains moving apart. And now the median Democrat voter is, there's only a tiny fraction of Republican voters who are more liberal than the median Democrat voters. We're losing this overlap in the US. And when you do the same thing for conservative and Labour supporters, which I realize is a moving political spectrum right now, so we'll see how this remains relevant. But if you split conservatives and Labour going back to 1990s, again, very, very similar. You can see we're more to the liberal side of this distribution than the US in 1990. And you roll forward to now, this is our position. So we have moved much more liberally. Key theme is liberalization. We're not the US, but is there some nascent polarization there between conservative and Labour supporters? Not much yet, not as much as you would get from the rhetoric about culture wars in the UK, but it is something for us to bear in mind. So final point for me is I think when you're looking at the most important trends of our times, what we'd argue, I guess, in the end from this is it's not really culture war divisions in the UK as yet, as long as we don't follow down that US path too much. The real challenge is how diverse and polarized values are becoming worldwide, globally, and that is setting some of the tensions that we're seeing. And I think the value of these sorts of studies is that we often overestimate the division within a nation while we ignore the divides and divergence across nations. And I think that's the big lesson. This is a kind of bias that we're all subject to. And that's where these types of studies really prove their value in correcting those types of misperceptions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bobby. And I think a really powerful example of both the value of cross-national studies, but also of time series, research as well. So we've got a few minutes for questions for Bobby, and I should say that Bobby's not able to stay for the panel.
No, unfortunately.
So if you do have any burning questions you're going to ask then, do ask them now while we have them in the room. I had one just
Yeah.
while people are sort of thinking of one,
Yeah.
which was about the extent to which you balance sort of questions that have been asked over a long period of time with bringing in new items. Can you just say a bit about how the World Value Survey manages that process?
Yeah, I mean, the World Value Survey, not dissimilar to other major international ones, has a scientific committee that reviews the questionnaires over time, but it is quite stable, as Rory was saying. The value of this, it does get quite hard to change it because the value is the long-term trends. They are the most used questions and the ones that people really value. There is actually a slight technical coming together going on right now between European Value Survey and World Value Survey, where they are trying to harmonize more and more of the questions across European Value Survey and World Value Survey, because there's a partnership deal between them that means that you can cover, there's a 50% overlap in questionnaires already historically, but if you can get that up to 60, 70% of the questionnaire, then you can start to think about running them both together. So, which would be amazing, because there is a kind of, there's sections in European Value Survey that would be great to also have within this time series as well. So it's, and then at the end, all what you have in terms of complete flexibility is to add 20 questions of your own. So just for people to note that we added the moral foundations theory, the MFQ2 version, the new version that Jonathan Haidt and Mohammed Atari has developed. So we have got a random probability based version of moral foundations theory questionnaire, which is a great kind of a great kind of complementary approach to the Schwartz values that the basic human values that ESS covers. So that is a really useful experimental thing to test. And we found in our analysis so far that the dimensions that Haidt and Atari and others came up with for the US worked really well within the UK, the 6 dimensions that they came up as moral foundation. So, and we added others on polarization to answer some of the clients' interests from Cabinet Office and others. So there is some flexibility for additional items.
And in terms of data availability, what's the
All
most
freely
recent?
available, all the freely available on the WVSA website, which there's links on our website to, and immediately available as well. Actually, there's no holding back of the data too.
Excellent.
What do you mean by the same?
Yeah,
Can you just repeat the question for those online?
I mean, just asking whether why we said the height categories of 6 moral foundations worked well in the UK. It's James is here and he can tell you lots more about this at the break. But it basically, they work as factors that are coherent within the UK and they group together in the same sorts of ways that they do in the US. There is a couple of more technical question marks over it if you're really interested in it, where one of the foundations may be a bit less so in the UK than the US. And it's a really interesting area. So I think it is worth checking with James.
Thank you. Any final questions for Bobby? Nick and then Rory.
Sorry, can you go back to the one about increasing polarization, the slide about increasing polarization worldwide?
I've got too many animations. We'll get there. Oh God, I should have just escaped and come back again. Here we are.
Yeah, because it seems that you could draw a slightly different conclusion from that. Because if you look at the countries that were in it from the start, they've all gone they've all gone up pretty much the same extent from the continents rather, except from, I assume that's Asia that has gone down. And so that change has come about partly because you've got Asia going down and everything else is going up.
Yeah.
And you added Oceania, which is from the very beginning, it's been completely different from everywhere else. So you could make a conclusion that almost all of the world is exactly the same as in terms of it's as bundled together as it ever was.
I don't think so fully, because Oceania's been in there from the beginning with the same countries. It
Oh,
is,
is that Africa? Sorry.
yeah,
I-
Africa.
yeah, sorry.
Africa was a bit more
So we take
recent.
the original five, they're pretty much bunched together as they were.
Yeah, there's a bit,
except for one mover.
there's a bit more detail behind this than this simplification. And there's more, some of those countries that look like they end don't actually end because they get lost into the, don't start later. They do go all the way back. So I think it's still, this is a simplified representation of more analysis that we've done on increasing spread for ones that were in from the beginning. So it's definitely true that there's been increased diversity, not just because you're adding new countries. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And final question to Rory.
Yeah, I just wonder, in terms of over time within the UK, but also in other countries, what kind of methodological changes have there been in terms of how that data collected? And do you think it matters, or does it not matter?
It does matter, and this is a really good question, one that we really want to link up with ESS on their methodological develops, because what we ended up with was more or less a 50-50 self-completion face-to-face split because of the pandemic, effectively, in a knock to nudge approach, not in just an incentive-based approach. But pure random probability, as was David Vosey's version of 2018 EVS. So what we're trying to do in the UK, which I supported by ESRC and lots of others, is to put this on a firm, robust methodological footing from now on. With WVS internationally, I think it doesn't have the controls that you have for ESS in terms of methodological controls. So there is different methodologies that are less controlled in other countries in WVS than there would be in ESS. So I think we have to take some trade-off there between that level of methodological rigor, but I've been able to reach more countries over a longer period of time. And there is some trade-offs, definitely some trade-offs there, where I would love it to be as clean and well controlled as ESS, but the history of WVS doesn't have that within it. It's still got good standards. I don't want to overemphasize that, but it's not the same kind of model. I think what we're trying to do is look to the future and try to make sure that you've got that basis. Now we've got within the UK, you've now got a 6-year span. Once you start to get a 10-year span with the next round of WVS. Then you've got a great basis going forward for it.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much, Bobby. We've now got a 10-minute break before our next presentation. So I think there's refreshments outside. And then if we could all be back in here for 3:15. Thank you very much. That's great. Lovely slides. No, I'm always saying that. Slides matter.
Slides do.
Especially when you're trying
Our
to.
audiences.
Especially like the fact Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good cup of tea, whether it was you're here with us in the room or virtually at home. I'm really delighted now to welcome Brianna Pirelli-Harris, who is going to talk about the cross-national research that she has been doing on fertility and family change using the generations and gender study. So I'll pass over now to Brianna. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to celebrate the ESS, but also to provide some information on the Generations and Gender Survey. So first of all, I'd like to say congratulations to the team. The ESS, of course, is very well used among demographers, sociologists, and the social science community in general. We really, really appreciate this research. It's got an impressive dashboard. It's easy to download. As Rory mentioned, students use it. I've had my students use it multiple times for dissertations. We can use it quickly for chapters, or of course, use it for far more in-depth, complicated research. So, the ESS is also conceived as part of social science research infrastructures in general. We've been trying to draw on some of the synergies across these social science research infrastructures across Europe. As you can see, ESS spans the life course, but there are other surveys and survey programs which focus on specific parts of the life course. So I'm going to talk about the GGP, the Generations and Gender Program, which focuses on young adults to midlife. So this period of forming families, forming partnerships. Of course, people form partnerships later as well, but it's the reproductive ages that we're particularly interested in this survey. So the GGP originally started in 2004, also I guess 20 years, and GGS round 1 was conducted from 2004 to 2011. The UK was not part of the original GGS round 1. There were about 19 countries that participated. It was intended to be longitudinal, but each country had to find its own funding. So in the end, only 3 countries had 3 waves. But one of the unique features about the Generations and Gender Survey is that it asked lots of questions about people's partnerships and fertility histories. So one of the unique features was this database called the Harmonized Histories of Partnership and Fertility Events. So this database was based on these 19 GGS countries, but we also brought in other surveys that had partnership and fertility histories, including Understanding Society here in the UK and other types of surveys where these events were recorded. Then another feature of the GGP is the contextual database, which includes information about policies and economic indicators, et cetera. So around 2020, the GGS team decided that they wanted to start a new round of survey data collection. So this wave 1 is currently available in 10 countries. You can see them here, and it's forthcoming for 9 countries or territories. Territories being, for example, Buenos Aires, not all of Argentina. But you can see that it has expanded beyond Europe and includes countries such as Taiwan and Hong Kong and Uruguay. So it's not just about Europe anymore. It's trying to become a global infrastructure for collecting data about families. And so there are other countries which are trying to find funding. For example, Italy and Poland, actually Poland and Italy have both secured funding, but the GGP is constantly trying to find new countries to add to its data collection efforts. So it too is meant to be longitudinal, and wave 2 has been developed and it is currently in the field in Norway. And we will be looking for further funding for wave 2 in the UK. So what are the topics that are covered? As I mentioned, these histories are key. It's the only place where full information about people's partnership formation is collected. This data on cohabitation in particular is not available in other resources, especially, for example, censuses don't collect this full-scale partnership retrospective information. And there are a few databases where we have information about people living together and forming families without being married. So it's really important for understanding this new behavioral increase, this increase in cohabitation. And the GGS includes standard information, standard socioeconomic and demographic background information about the childhood family, education, religiosity, etc. But it also includes other questions as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. So here's an example of how this information about partnership formation is really useful. What you can see here is from a study that we conducted several years ago, and it was using round 1 of the GGS. It uses latent class growth models to look at how people form partnerships from the ages of 15 to 45. And class 1, sorry that it's very small, but class 1 is a traditional partnership type. So people enter into marriage in their early 20s, and then they stay in marriage throughout the full reproductive years until they're about 45. But then there are different types of partnership patterns that different people enter into. And if you look at the very bottom one, which is class 8, you can see that a complete change where people are entering into cohabiting partnerships later in the life course, maybe around 20, 35, or 30, and then they stay in these cohabiting partnerships and never marry. So there's a range of ways that people are now entering into partnerships, marrying, separating, and divorcing, and this type of analysis can capture that. And then with cross-national analysis, we can see what percent of each population falls into each of these classes, so how it differs across countries and then across time. And this provides important information about how partnership formation is diverging, for example, by educational groups, and how countries are similar or different from each other. So this is just a little example of what you can do with these partnership histories. But the GGS covers far more information than just about partnership and fertility histories. There's information about employment, irregular work schedules, the partner's education and employment, work-family balance attitudes, and information about parents, other people in the household, and intergenerational relations. So it's a very rich database. So in 2022, the ESRC funded the GGS in the UK for the first time, and it's directly comparable to international GGSs. It includes all adults age 18 to 59, and you'll note that our sample size is relatively large. We have about 7,200 people, and this is important because we want to try to dig down into the diversity of family types, of living arrangements, and with this sample size, we can, for example, study lone parents, or as you'll see in a minute, people who don't have children. So we need a large sample size to be able to examine people in these different types of families and who are employed or unemployed or using substandard or non-standard work. So the sample size is really quite important with the GGSs. This survey in the UK was conducted completely online with NatSend, and the GGS originally was conducted face-to-face, but here we've decided to just do it purely online. And we've analyzed moving to an online survey in a methodological work package led by Olga Maslovskaya. And in that work package, we look at data quality, representativeness of the survey, as well as different experiments, for example, with incentives or QR codes. And then we are also doing more substantive analysis in another work package, working with Anne Barrington and Bernice Kwong, the postdoc, to analyze partnership and fertility histories and childcare. So a couple of points about the GGS in the UK. It is a very recent survey conducted in 2022, 2023. So this is post-COVID, but during the cost of living crisis. And we do have questions bespoke to the UK on ethnicity and Brexit and a couple of other questions as well. And this data set is now available at the UK Data Service and GGP Hub. So another example about what you can use the data for. This is based on preliminary analysis with just the UK GGS. We hope to expand it to other countries, but at the moment we're just analyzing the UK GGS. So as you may know, fertility rates over the past couple of decades have fallen quite dramatically throughout Europe and the English-speaking world. If you look at this graph, you can see that sorry, it's a little bit small, but in 2008 was the Great Recession, but starting around 2012, fertility rates fell quite dramatically in many countries unexpectedly. So the Nordic countries are wondering what's going on. And you can see that in the UK, we also had a decline in fertility to levels which were not expected. So that's the blue line. And so everybody is wondering why, what is going on? Why is fertility falling in so many different countries and so rapidly? And one of the issues that we're interested in looking at is how preferences to have children have changed over time. So what you can see here is the intention to ever have a child among childless men and women using the UK GGS. And it's really quite fascinating because we can see the changes over time by cohort. Now, you have to remember that this is among people who do not have children. So if you look at Gen X, who are age 42 to 44 at the time of the survey, it's not surprising that nearly 60% of people age 42 to 44 who don't have children don't want to have children. So that makes sense. But what's really striking is Gen Z, age 18 to 24. Because with Gen Z, you can see that nearly 15% say they definitely do not want to have children. Another 10% say that they probably don't want to have children. And 20% are unsure, with only a little bit over half saying that they probably or definitely want to have children. And that is a massive shift from what has happened previously. So we have a study that was conducted on the millennial generation at the same age. The questions were worded slightly differently because it was from the GSS, but you can see that the millennials at the same age said that a much higher proportion said that they wanted to have children. So 50 to 60% of childless people said that they were going to have children, and it was only about 5 to 10% who said that they didn't want to have children. So this is a remarkable shift for this Gen Z, and we don't know what's going on. So there's been a lot of speculation in the media that this is the result of economic uncertainty or global climate change, possibly the environmental uncertainty or the cost of living crisis. And so we have information in our survey that can help us to better understand the reasons underlying this change. So the first question is, how do intentions to remain childless differ according to global uncertainties, the environment and the economy? And are individuals' concerns about their own economic situation associated with the intention to have a child? So apologies, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because I don't have much time, but I want to give you a little taster of what this study shows. It's a sample of the childless men and women aged 18 to 44 who are not currently pregnant. There's about 2,000 of them in our survey, so large enough to analyze, but it's a little bit more difficult to do it by cohort once we start breaking down the cohorts. So we keep them all at everybody of this age in our study. We use multinomial logistic regression with an outcome variable of definitely or probably no, unsure or definitely or probably yes. And we have a whole range of controls from the survey. To measure global uncertainties, we have a battery of questions that asks people to think about the future and rate how much the following worries them. So there's 2 sets based on EFA, 2 factors. One we call the environmental worry score, and this is climate change and overpopulation, population pressure. And the other is related to economic, epidemics, conflict, those types of worries. And then for the individual level, we look at objective measures, which are standard employment and unemployment activity status and household income. And we look at subjective measures, which are a little bit unusual and capture people's attitude towards their financial situation, both in the past, so compared to parents, when they were your age, do you consider yourself better or worse off? And thinking about the future. So we asked, do you think that your financial situation will improve in the next 3 years? So again, sorry, this is going to go really fast. Basically, what we find is no association or a very weak association that these intentions vary according to concerns about the environment. We find practically no association about worries for the economy. So there's no association for these general uncertainties or global uncertainties. In terms of specific conditions, we find that if people expect their future financial situation to become better, then they are more likely to want to have a child. So financial situation improves, more likely to intend to have a child. And also if they think that they are doing better than their parents. So this one says, those who think their financial situation is better than their parents are more likely to intend to have a child. So to conclude, again, we have this dramatic increase in reported intentions to remain childless. And how should this be interpreted? Is it that people are now willing or able to say, to state their true desires, while previously social norms would have tampered down those effects? So people now can say what they really want to with respect to intentions? Or do these responses reflect short-term intentions rather than a lifetime of childlessness? So people will change their intentions as they get older. Or are they permanent shifts in people's desires for children? So these are some of the questions that we don't know the answers to, but they do have implications for the UK's fertility in the future. The concerns about the environment and the economy were not very important. If anything, those who are more concerned were more likely to intend to have a child. But we saw very strong associations with both objective and subjective measures of individual level economic uncertainty, which was consistently associated with lower intentions to have a child, specifically with respect to being economically inactive, having a lower household income, being pessimistic about their future income, and thinking they're worse off relative to their parents at the same age. So we have clear findings that these economic concerns are most important for future childbearing. So what we want to do in future research is to see how these UK results compare to those in other European countries. There is a lot of evidence that does show that economic uncertainty is associated with low fertility. So we do know that this is the case in many other countries, but we don't know about some of the specifics, especially with respect to global uncertainties. And the GGS is intended to be a longitudinal survey with follow-up every 3 years. So we hope to be able to return back to people and see whether or not they fulfilled their intentions or if their intentions themselves changed over time. And like the ESS, the GGP wants to be an international infrastructure and is aiming to try to get its own ERIC. So thank you again for this opportunity to talk about the value of cross-national research.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brianna. We've got a few minutes for questions before we go to our final speaker. I'm also conscious we haven't been very good at picking up on any online questions about the individual. Okay, if you could let me know if we do. And there's a question at the back.
Thanks for the presentation. Just a couple of thoughts actually, I don't know how relevant they might be. You were looking at the fertility rate in general terms. I mean, will you probably get different trends, if you like, if you break that down by ethnicity? We might get something very different because the fertility rate might be very different by ethnicity. Related question to that is, when you said you were adding some questions about ethnicity to research, what are you trying to explore? I'm very interested in that. And finally, your last slide was about the value of cross nation or cross country value. There might be a value in cross ethnicity kind of research as well.
Great. So we've got three related questions there about ethnicity and your work, Brianna. Over to you.
Yes, well, we would in theory like to study ethnicity a bit more in detail, but unfortunately with our sample size, even though it's larger than other surveys, it's not large enough to be able to look at different ethnic groups. So we have a basic control for whether or not somebody was born in the country or not, but with this particular subset of the childless people, we can't look specifically at fertility intentions by ethnicity. And yes, of course, within countries, there is substantial variation by ethnicity, by other types of factors. But I think mostly we intend to compare across countries rather than within countries. And even though the sample sizes are large, it could be possibly some studies could exploit the differences in ethnicity because we do ask about it, but not for this particular study.
And in terms of the questions asked about ethnicity, was that simply so that you knew the ethnic background of the participants rather than?
Yes, and it was models on the census question. So we basically just took the census question and put it into the GGS.
Lovely, thank you. Any other questions for Brianna?
Right, I'm afraid it's a fairly similar question related to
We did, and they were remarkably similar. And so again, because of small sample size, we wanted to show it by cohort rather than gender differences. So we have gender as a control in our models, but the differences didn't emerge by gender and by cohort as much as we would have expected. But we've done interactions with all of our different variables, and there isn't that much that's interesting that arises in terms of differences between men and women.
Can I ask a final question, which is just about what we know about the extent to which people's views about whether they want to have children in their 20s change as they get older. So I mean, there must be other studies, some of the longitudinal studies that allow you to get a sense of, you know, what proportion of people who say I absolutely don't want a child when they're in their, you know, early 20s, then go on to have kids.
Yeah, the study that comes to mind is based on US data. And actually people's fertility intentions get revised downwards. So the survey that I'm thinking of, I think it was in the 1990s or so, a very small proportion never wanted to have children. It was maybe 5%. So that's why I think that we're so surprised by these findings, because previously everything has been revised downwards because people don't achieve their aims. And then there are all sorts of reasons why they aren't able to meet those intentions. So we haven't seen a lot of evidence that they're going to revise them upwards over time, but maybe we'll see that in this GGS.
Brilliant. Okay. Oh, one final question.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I was quite fast when we started with. And I know we went through quite quickly. It explored like less traditional family structures, like the rise of one generations, and similarly like how sexuality and
Yes, again, the sample sizes would be too small to even be able to really incorporate much in terms of same-sex couples. We ask a lot of questions about each partner and whether or not there were any sort of same-sex partnerships, but a relatively small proportion of the sample identifies as either homosexual, or actually that question isn't in there specifically. What we ask is about partners, same, just the, whether or not their partner was male or female over time. And in round one, it definitely would have been too small to capture. We haven't looked that much at it here in the UK GGS, but maybe there's a bit that you can do with. There are some studies in other countries that are trying to see whether or not the proportion of people who identify a same-sex partner is similar to other surveys or censuses. And it seems relatively similar, but still, by the time you get down to the sample size, it's not large enough, unfortunately.
It's always the way.
Yes.
Right. In that case, many thanks again, Brianna. And we'll now move on to our fourth and final speaker, who is Natalie Maplethorpe, who is going to talk to us about the final study in this roundup, which is the International Social Survey Programme. So over to you, Natalie.
Great, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invite to celebrate ESS and to tell you more about the International Social Survey Programme.
Just keep the mic, is that right?
Yeah, of course. So today I'll just be going through what is the International Social Survey Programme, or ISSP as it's known, which topics are covered. I'll give you a flavour of some of the findings from ISSP, both from BSA and SSA, and also some international authors who've used the data, and explain how you can access the ISSP data yourselves. So starting off, what is the ISSP? So it's an international collaborative programme of 45 different countries across the world. Each country conducts annual surveys with a representative sample of the adult population. And the ISSP module covers questions on beliefs, attitudes, opinions, and behaviour. These are asked at regular intervals, so it means data can enable cross-sectional and longitudinal analysis. In terms of organisation, it's a very democratic structure. The members vote for the ISSP Secretariat. So at present, that's Switzerland. So they've been the Secretariat from 21 to 24. And within ISSP, there's various methodology committees and working groups. So a methodology committee, working groups looking at various different methodological issues. There's drafting groups who work on the ISSP questionnaires. And there's an archive integrating the national data into ISSP data. So a short history of the ISSP. It was founded in 1984 by 4 countries, so Australia, Germany, Great Britain, and USA. Like ESS, Roger Gell was also involved in the establishment of ISSP, and it developed out of cooperation of general social surveys and projects. The first module was asked in 1985, and that was on the role of government. And as I mentioned, at present, there are 45 member countries. Members consist of academic organisations, universities, or survey institutes such as NatCen. There aren't any membership fees, and countries can apply to join ISSP. Their application is reviewed, so the methodology is scrutinised, and members vote on whether or not new countries join. There aren't any central or common funds, so each member funds its own survey. And since its inception, more than 1 million respondents have taken part in ISSP surveys. So a huge number of respondents in ISSP. So talking about ISSP members, we don't have quite as many countries as the World Values Survey. I was tallying up how many different countries. So there's 45 across North and South America. Europe is very well represented, as you can see from the map. Africa, Asia, and Australia and Oceanica. So that gives you a flavour of the countries that are involved. ISSP in Britain is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, so I wanted to thank ESRC for their continued support. It's been fielded on the British Social Attitude Survey and Scottish Social Attitudes. During the pandemic, it was also fielded on the NatCen Opinion Panel as well, which some of you might be familiar with already. In terms of methodology on BSA, we were previously face-to-face. During the pandemic, we made the switch to a web survey with the option of a telephone interview. ISSP is actually asked as a module within BSA, so it's asked on a sample of around 1,500 respondents. So on BSA 23, we covered national identity on citizenship, and this year on BSA and SSA, we'll be fielding the module on digital societies. So fieldwork for that will be around August, September this year. So which topics are covered on ISSP? I think there is some overlap with some of the other surveys that we've been talking about today. Large range of topics, so citizenship, digital societies, the environment, family and changing gender roles, health and healthcare, leisure time and sports, national identity, religion, role of government, social inequality, social networks, and work orientations. So these topics are repeated at regular intervals, so you can do longitudinal analysis. And just to note as well that members can propose new modules. So for example, we're including the digital societies module this year. So how are the modules for ISSP developed? So members can submit a module proposal. So this could be a proposal to repeat an existing module or to submit an idea for a new module, for example, the digital societies. A questionnaire is developed by the drafting group, and this is shared with ISSP members. As we're conducting the research in 45 countries, some questions may not work in some country contexts. So the drafting group collects feedback from the member countries. They then conduct a pre-test in selected countries and then share an updated questionnaire and results of the pre-test with member countries. These are then discussed at the General Assembly. The General Assembly is quite an interesting, unique sort of experience on ISSP. 45 different countries, well, up to 45, come together in one location and go through the questionnaire, question by question, discussing, feeding back. It can be a very involved, passionate sort of process, as you can imagine. And then it's very democratic. So at the end of the session, there's voting on every single question. And if we don't get a majority vote, the question isn't included. So I've heard the assembly described as a mixture of Eurovision meets the UN, which is fairly accurate, I think. So the questionnaire is finalized at the end of the assembly, usually to much applause, and then it is implemented in the member countries. So talking now about some of the findings from ISSP. So publications using ISSP data are available in the ISSP bibliography of the GASIS website. Since 2017, the International Journal of Sociology has published an annual special issue using the latest ISSP data. I'm going to talk to you now about some findings from recent BSA and SSA reports. And I've also looked at the bibliography and just picked out a selection of papers which have used the sort of cross-country data, just to give you a flavour of how other researchers are using ISSP data. So the first is findings from the BSA report from last year. So that was the BSA 40 report. It was a chapter covering gender roles. So this used data from the ISSP 2020 Family and Changing Gender Roles module. So it explored who should primarily provide childcare for children under school age and who should primarily cover the costs of this childcare. In both 2012 and 2020, family members were most frequently selected as the category who should primarily provide childcare, with slightly less than half selecting the category. There was a slight increase in the proportion who feel that government agencies should be responsible for providing childcare to preschool children. So from 16% in 2012 to 20% now. In terms of funding, people were more supportive of government agencies having a role in terms of funding childcare. This is fairly evenly split between thinking government agencies, 45%, and family members should primarily cover the costs of childcare for children under school age, although slightly more people believe that the government should be responsible for the costs. So the proportion of people who thought the government should primarily fund childcare increased by 50% since 2012, from 30% to 45%. Moving on now to some findings from the Scottish Social Attitude Survey. I think really interesting topic is Scotland more like its Nordic neighbours than England? So is Scotland more Nordic than liberal? This used data from SSA and BSA and also the ISSP 2019 social inequality module. So people in Scotland were most likely to think that the income distribution is unfair. So 73% in Scotland said the distribution of incomes in Britain is unfair, compared with 65% in England. In the Nordic countries, where income equality is much lower, only 38% of people in Denmark and 52% of people in Norway claim that income differences between higher and lower earners is unfair. And in Finland, where income equality has increased substantially, 63% claim income distribution is unfair. I might skip over this, just aware of time, but this is about attitudes towards buying better education and healthcare. So Scotland lay between England and the Nordic countries, and then people in Scotland were most likely to say that they live in an unequal society. So some interesting findings from Scotland there. We will be publishing some findings from BSA and SS. We will be publishing some findings from the most recent ISSP in the BSA 2023 report. This is a bit of a shameless plug for the BSA report launch, which is happening on the 12th of June. But we'll be using data from the ISSP 2023 module on national identity and citizenship, and that'll be covered in chapters on attitudes to immigration and differences in attitudes to national identity and national pride in England and Scotland. So you can register for that event online. I've selected some of the papers mentioned in the book bibliography on the GASIS site, just to give a sort of flavour of how other researchers are using the cross-national data. So the first used data from the 2015 work orientations module to measure job satisfaction. Mean job satisfaction scores were in the 5.2 to 5.4 range. The UK sat pretty solidly amongst the average at 5.4. The highest job satisfaction levels are in Venezuela, Switzerland, Austria, and Mexico, and lowest in Poland, China, and Japan. There were significant differences in mean job satisfaction scores between public and private sector employees as well. So that's just an example of how the data from that work orientations module is being used. Drawing another example, this time using the 2016 role of government model. So this analysed data from 23 countries using multi-level regression models to explore perceptions of civil servant corruption. So wide variations in public perceptions. The highest aggregates were in Chile, Lithuania, and Turkey, and lowest in New Zealand, Norway, and Switzerland. So again, giving them a flavour of the kind of data and how it's been used in a cross-country way. Finally, another example from the 2011 health module. This also made use of 2014 ESS data, finding that individuals engage more frequently in health promoting behaviour in countries with higher levels of economic development. There was also found a tighter connection between healthy lifestyles and health in countries with high levels of economic development, and a growth in economic development increased the engagement of health promoting behaviours. So again, just giving you a sample of how researchers have made use of the ISSP data. So in terms of accessing ISSP data, I think much like the other surveys that we've spoken about today, it's considered as a public good for the research community. So ISSP data and documentation can be downloaded free of charge from the GASIS data catalogue. You can also access methodological reports, for example, on study monitoring or the development of questionnaires, also at GASIS, and you can find more general information at the ISSP website. The download of datasets generally requires a login at GASIS, but this is free of charge. It's open to all and gives you access to the various services. So easy to gain access to the ISSP datasets. So just summing up of ISSP, collaboration of 45 countries, conducting high quality surveys with representative samples. Spoke through the range of topics that are covered, so allowing for cross-country and time series analysis. The data sets are available free of charge. So just finishing that, does anybody have any questions?
Thank you very much, Natalie. So any questions for Natalie? I've got to say the UN, what was it, Eurovision meets UN. I have for my sins also attend some ISSP meetings, and that's
It's a
actually really,
unique
it's a really
experience.
good, it's a really good analogy.
What's that? What compliance? So I'm going to flag Wales in. You were talking about Scotland and England, but noticeably not Wales. Probably a promise after that, but why not?
I think that was for that particular research question, and I think it's something that has been raised, the sort of similarity with Scotland versus the Nordic countries, and in terms of similarities. I didn't see why Wales would be included. We do include Wales in BSA analysis as well. So just to note, it's not it's included. I think that just Scotland was a focus for that particular research paper.
I follow up that matter. I suppose in a way, got the Scottish social studies.
We do.
Just wondering whether you've got any future intentions to make it sent to Wales and also Northern Ireland.
Wales is included as part of the sample on BSA, and there has been discussion about including Welsh boost, so that's something that's discussed. Similarly as well, we're discussing potentially including Northern Ireland as well. So don't worry, they're not forgotten.
Thank you very much. I mean, I guess it's a sort of it's a theme that's come up a couple of times, isn't it? About particular groups that are relatively small in their number within a particular sample, and the challenge then of what you do if you want to look at them in detail. Any final questions for Natalie? And do we have any questions online? No, in that case, let's move to the panel discussion. So I think we can take the slides down. Brilliant. And if I could ask Brianna and Rory and Natalie to join me on these seats. Will we be okay in terms of the audio sitting there? Yeah, okay, great. Like the worst job in the world. Rina, in terms of speaking, can we just normal voice?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so if we could just all try and speak up. So the way we've got, what we've got now is we've got about half an hour. We're going to start with a sort of discussion between the four of us with just some prompts from me, and then I'm going to open it up just to questions from you. So I mean, do have a think about anything that struck you as you've been listening to these talks that's really relevant to all four of the studies that the majority of the studies that we talked about. So my first question is simply, you know, all of these studies I think have made a really compelling case for their answering specific research questions for the research team, but also being a research infrastructure that's available to the social science community and beyond. And so my first question is, how can we try and attract more users to these amazing data sets? I think we've seen some great examples of what's already happening in this space, but it'd just be really helpful to hear from the studies about what are you doing to try and get more people in who maybe aren't familiar with the kind of data that we're talking about, and sort of help them realise its potential. Rory, I'm going to start.
That's a really good question. I think the key here, I guess, is who are the users that we're missing? So I think one of them groups who could be users of these studies are people who don't actually want to work directly with the data, but would like to have more information about the findings and how each of the infrastructures communicates those. I think is really important. I really liked what Bobby Duffy had done with the World Value Survey, those short summaries. That's a really nice way, I think, to communicate. So more of that to communicate to people who don't want to work with the data. More training on how to use the data. And more interoperability. I mean, I think this is an area, unfortunately, we're going backwards in. Used to be that a lot of these international surveys, you could analyze them online through a single source of analysis called Nestar. That's no longer available, and now some of the surveys you can't analyze them online without downloading them at all. So we've kind of gone backwards, and each survey is in a different location and how to produce the data. So I think more work between the surveys to harmonize how the outputs are made available, that could really help.
Great, thank you very much, Rory. Brianna, any reflections from you?
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, our data sets are a bit complicated, which might restrict users who do not have at least some basic quantitative method skills, to be honest. So we have talked about this a lot at the GGP, on the consortium board, and they are trying to standardize it in order on their website, for example, Collectica, which has standard formats. So they have standardized all of the surveys and standardized versions already on the website, the GGP website. So they're attempting to try to get the word out to the active community. And one way that we are doing this in particular is going to workshops, for example, the British Society for Population Studies, and we're going to be doing workshops at different conferences and trying to spread the word that way among people who are interested in studying, are using this kind of data. But it is also special license data, and this is because we have we have month of birth, month of partnership formation, and so therefore it has to be protected. So I think that's one of the challenges, or the trade-offs, is that if you want to collect this complicated information about people's lives, you do have to protect it. So it is special license data. So I'm afraid I can't envision a world in which it's really available for people to use. We have discussed maybe a dashboard or something like that, for simple measures to be able to compare across countries easily. But I think that it has to carefully and for academic users more than private.
Right, thank you. And Natalie, the ISSP has obviously been around for a long time. Any reflections you have of just trying to increase the number of people who are interested in that data, either thinking about what we do in the UK or just thinking about what other countries have done?
I mean, it's obviously a hugely valuable resource to researchers of data across a huge variety of topics. In terms of sort of encouraging researchers, there are a number of events. I know ISSP at the moment are planning an event and offering a prize to researchers for best presentation, so trying to encourage users to submit a paper to an event. In terms of in the UK, obviously we feel the model BSA, so there's that link with BSA, and we include ISSP data BSA reporting. So I think that's something to continue, but that also, I think for us to be making other ISSP outputs as well, I think it may not be us aware of it. I think that's part of BSA. Obviously, we've got some very interesting data, as I was saying this year, that of building modern digital society. So that's what we think about attitudes to AI, to digital work. I think there'll be some really interesting findings coming out of that. So I think we need to just think of opportunities for publicising.
Yeah. I mean, that certainly strikes a chord with me, that it's much easier to promote something when you've got really tangible findings about something that's doing it in this attractive, accessible way. So that's really helpful. So my second question kind of struck me when Natalie was talking about the ISSP and how it designs a module. So I haven't pre-warned you about this question, I'm afraid. But it's the kind of, I guess, a herding cats question of can you talk to us about how your two studies manage that process of designing a core questionnaire that works across all these different countries with input from the different countries who might not have views about what will and won't work for them. But obviously, you need to come up with something that's sufficiently generic to run across all of them, that won't necessarily give us in the UK, say, the exact question we'd want if we were only designing the question for us. So I don't know if that gives you enough of a hook to just reflect maybe Brianna first on how that's managed by GGP, and then Rory to say a bit about ESS.
Yeah, so the GGS, I didn't mention this, but the GGS grew out of family fertility surveys that started in the 19th. And so there was an interest around the world in populations and what was going on, fertility and the changes in fertility rates. And so at that time, the core questionnaire was developed. And then when the GGS took over, they didn't completely start from scratch, but there was a team of a consortium board that decided on the questions. And I have to admit, it was constrained to this group, and outsiders were not able to suggest questions. But I know this because I was an outsider at that time trying to make questions on the survey. They wouldn't change the format. It was also very much based on the theory of planned behavior. So it had a theoretical interest at that time. Over time, the team members changed. The consortium board remained the same. There was a questionnaire task force that tried to develop it to make it a little bit more modern or up to date. It was moving away from the theory of planned behavior and looking a lot more at, say, economic issues, economic uncertainty. And then certain teams went rogue and developed these modules. For example, the global uncertainties module, which I described, the Swedish and Norwegian team developed that module. It's not a part of the official core GGS, but many teams like this module so much, so we incorporated into our questionnaire. So that was one official way of having some of these modules that were cross-national. But then the GGS is recognizing that there needs to be more input from the academic community. So for wave 2, there was a call put out where people could propose modules on a certain set of questions. So they had 5 to 8 minutes to be able to suggest their own modules. And it was modeled on the ESS, however, much shorter application process. And I actually ended up heading this module committee. And then we looked through all of the applications and then selected. There was one consortium board member, team member, who evaluated each of these proposals, and then in a very transparent way, we ranked them and then decided what would fit into survey itself. So we are looking for ways of trying to bring in more suggestions. So that it's not just a certain board that makes all these decisions.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Rory, any reflections from you?
Well, with ESS, the initial core questionnaire was developed with academic leads covering different domains, and they led on a particular chapter and wrote that and then justified the questions. And I think that was all done at breakneck speed. So I don't think there was a lot of other input really into how that was done. But we tried to improve on that going forward in the future. So teams of academics who win this module competition, they design a 30-item module. They have to outline the theory, they then outline the draft questions. There's then a kind of process for about 1.5 years where they're discussed with the national coordinators, but also pre-tested thoroughly. So we did cognitive testing in multiple countries at the same time to really check the questions have a similar meaning with respondents. So we're not just asking academics sort of for their views, but really testing them carefully with the respondents. And then also doing further quantitative piloting as well. So we've really, I think through those mechanisms, tried to ensure the questions work well across countries. But it is a different model to ISSP. There's no democracy basically. In the end, it's the question module design team in collaboration with the core scientific team headquarters that make the final decision. So there's no voting sort of on a particular question. It's a sort of different model.
Absolutely, brilliant, thank you. So a sort of final question for me before we open this up is that you've all spoken really clearly about how to take a study that's been going for a long time and develop the sort of methodology of data collection in line with, events, obvious one, but also just changing the practice and survey methodology. Can you sort of give a sense of where you'd like your particular survey series to be in, say, 20 years' time? Or I'll go back to you to take a second with that one.
I think this is a good question, because I think survey research in some ways has been quite a lot of hasn't been a lot of development maybe, and particularly in cross-national surveys, they tended to stay quite the same for a long time, and now there has been this push with a move to online surveys. I think for ESS, one of the things that's quite exciting for the future is our cross-national online probability-based panel. That we'd really like to see as a big part of the future of the ESS. So we asked people at the end of the main ESS if they would agree to join our panel. Quite a lot of them agree, and then we've done follow-up surveys with them either online or using paper self-completion questionnaires. And I think that having a bit more flexibility through those methods would help to speed up cross-national research. At the moment, it's done in academic circles, is often very slow. And I think that maybe provides the first part of kind of adaptation in the future, and then who knows, once we've got those panelists engaged, there's maybe more things that we could do. So I think for me that would be something I'd really see developing for the future, and possibly even involving them in the assessment countries outside of Europe as well. Would be quite exciting.
Brilliant, thank you. Natalie, over to you. Any insights from ISSP?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one which was actually raised at the ISSB 40th anniversary celebration in May. I think one of the points that was raised was expanding the number of countries. So I think you can see on the map of ISSB quite Europe focused, less in sort of South America, Africa. So looking at expanding and sort of growing that knowledge base. I think another one of our considerations was thinking about each grouping questions as well. On ISSB, we ask questions of regular intervals, so it can be a number of years before we then ask them again. We're asking the Digital Societies module this year, so it'd be interesting to see how those questions look 7 or 8 years from now, and you think about how much can change. In terms of methodology as well, I've also seen a lot of the ISSB questions making the move from face-to-face to online, which is something that we're just seeing across surveys.
Right, thank you. And we have
Yes, a really challenging question. The GGP aims to be an era and to have 20 years into the future, but this particular round has 3 waves, so that takes us to 9 years total. So we haven't discussed what happens after this next round, but presumably we would continue to collect data on families. I think it is a really interesting challenge because there has been a shift to online surveys, but at the same time, there's also a reluctance for people to participate in surveys. And so we have this challenge of whether or not people will be willing to provide this information through surveys given issues about privacy. And we know that sometimes people are reluctant to provide a lot of detailed information about what even the partners that they had in the past for privacy reasons. And yet this is the only source of information on how people live in non-marital relationships. So it's really tricky because we want to know, and family formation is so incredibly important to understand if people were married at the time of having a child, how many partnerships did they have. There are lots of implications for child and adult well-being as to how many partnerships people had, but there's not a great way of collecting this data unless you ask people. And if it's done online, then there are issues with that. On the other hand, it's innovative, and in some ways it's so much more convenient. You know, take an online survey on your mobile phone, wherever. And so that's, I think we need to just be a little bit more creative and imaginative in how we try to capture this information with these new technologies and see what people are willing, what types of information people are willing to provide to us.
brilliant. Thank you very much. So we'll now open this up for questions, and I'll just go online first.
Yeah, we have it here. So do you mind to stand here and
I shall do that. So I'm not. Yes, I can. I'm just. Okay, so the first question is, can you talk about the potential loss of quality of responses in the transition from face-to-face to self-completion, and how the surveys will do that? I mean, to some extent, some of you have touched on that already with the sort of experimental work you've done. So it's a question really about quality in that move to online. And I guess also the time series. You know, we've talked about these core questions and how vital they are. Obviously, when we shift mode, we're affecting that time series. So I'll start with Natalie, if that's okay first, rather than always going to Rory. So any reflections from you on that?
In terms of ISSP, it's something that the methodology committees of various working groups are considering. Guidance has been shared with ISSP members on making the transition online. And it is something that the member countries are aware of and so considering the challenges of. On the SA, it's obviously something that we have to do. We've been doing analysis of sample composition as well. We made the move from face-to-face online in 2020 during the pandemic, and there's been a lot of analysis of the sample compositions achieved since then. We're confident with the data on the SA, and you know,
Thanks, Natalie. Rory, you've already mentioned some of the work you've done on ESRC. Is there anything you'd like to elaborate on?
So obviously, we know that mode changes will have an impact on ESS data. Anyway, we know that it will be on particular sets of questions, and we know that it will move in two ways. So in some areas, there might be improvements. So self-reported measures might help to reduce interview effects and reduce social desirability. So we can see some improvements there. But other types of questions, particularly more complex questions like highest level of education or occupation items, we might see the quality go down because there the interviewer was helping, encouraging more, and now they're no longer there. So it's going to be a mixed picture. I don't think it's that quality will go down with self-completion. I think in some cases it might go up. And I think for us, having this round where there'll be this split ballot experiment, half face-to-face, half self-completion, will really help. One thing I do want to say though is I think we need to be a bit careful, because I think sometimes the moves to self-completion are kind of seeing, particularly in terms of cooperation rates, quite big declines, getting close to single figures. And I think that for me is a worry. And I don't think as a field we should just accept that and go in that direction. I think we should still be looking at good cooperation rates and surveys, A, because it reduces the likelihood of bias, and B, it encourages, I think, faith in surveys. I think when members of the public see surveys with single-digit response rates, they don't accept them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a problem. And if we keep going down and down, I would be very worried.
Thanks, Rory. Couldn't agree more. Brianna, any reflections from you on that question about quality and the move to online?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Rory pointed out, there are some aspects which will actually improve. We had an experiment where we gave different incentives to different groups, different localities, and we found that if we provided a £20 incentive to low-income people living in low-income neighborhoods, they actually responded just as well, if not better. So there are certain measures that you can take with incentives to try to encourage people to take the surveys. So there, and I think also what's interesting is that we did find that in our online survey, it looks very similar to the face-to-face surveys, with more women, more highly educated people, more likely to take the survey. Another analysis that we did showed that people who made it through to the end of our survey ended up taking questions about what they thought about surveys in general and the perception of their experience taking the GGS. And remember, this could be a very long survey, from maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And those people who spent a long time taking the survey were actually happier with their experience than those people who rushed through it and had a short survey. And that might be people with few partnerships or people who didn't have children. And those were the ones who were more dissatisfied with the survey experience. And I think what that shows is that people who are dedicated to taking these surveys actually like taking them and there's a positive experience. But at the same time, it might be that people are incentivized by these higher incentives and then just get through the survey really quickly. Nonetheless, it seems like the data quality is similar for the two different groups. There's not a lot of break off, there's not a lot of non-response in the survey. So that's very encouraging. But I think it's getting more people to actually take that. And one thing I wanted to actually note with what I noticed with the ESS, and this question that I had for you, or if you don't mind, is that the response rates of say 30 to 35% were relatively similar across countries, but the sampling frameworks are vary dramatically across countries. In some countries, there would be a register where you can draw on the register and you have a name of a person with a specific address, and then you could ask that person specifically to participate in the survey. In the UK, we just have this postcode address file, and what we end up doing is just sending out a bunch of letters, and people sometimes answer, they open their mail or they don't. So it really depends on the sampling framework as well as to whether people answer the survey, but it looked like in your survey, it was similar across the different types of sampling framework.
Do you want to just respond to that briefly, Rory?
Just very briefly, so yeah, I think this is a big issue. It doesn't seem to have had a big impact on the response rates. You're right, so like the UK and German response rates are kind of relatively similar. So that's kind of reassuring that we've managed to like not have those big differences despite the sample frames. The challenge, of course, is in the UK and other countries without the names, you have to have a within household selection procedure. And we're looking at this actually in the Survey Futures project in the strand on surveys without field interviewers. And what we're trying to do at the moment is look into how the major agencies are playing this at the moment. It seems that most of them have gone away from the kind of approach that we've used in our surveys of next birthday to asking any 2 adults or any 1 adult or all adults. I don't think we know enough yet about how those different approaches compare, and I'm hoping that as we go forward this area we can look at 2.
Right, I've got a few more questions online, but I'll just pause here to see if there's any questions in the room.
Can I ask Brianna several things I've been thinking about on the online survey? At one point you mentioned the number of people who are answering on their mobile phone. Was this a factual thing?
Well, we do have device type, so, but I can't say off the top of my head what the proportion was that answered on the mobile phones. We do know that data quality was slightly worse for people who answered on the mobile phones. We, in the UK GGS team, spent quite some time trying to optimize the look and feel on the mobile phones to try to keep people engaged for as long as possible. But yeah, it's unfortunately worse quality because we would think that it would be very convenient if you could do it on the mobile phones. But it didn't always work. And just as a note, we can't ask people to fill out paper questionnaires because the survey is just too complicated with the skip patterns. But that's the thing.
What I was thinking about the right, talking about men and women simplified imagine the 2 partners who a questionnaire laptop, I think it's highly likely that they would agree.
Yeah.
And you would perhaps get the same 2 answers there. People would
well, there was only supposed to be 1 person answering the survey from each household. So we used this last birthday method. Whether or not they told us the truth about it is a different question. Yeah, so and we do have questions about whether or not everybody in the household should be eligible if they meet the age criteria, or whether or not it should be 1 person. We selected 1 person. That also might be why our response rates were slightly lower than the ESS. But there's, yeah, so
Can I jump in there? Actually, there's an online question that's sort of in this space. So how can you guarantee in self-completion mode the information comes from our respondent, i.e. the one you've selected, not from his or her household? And that's from Lilia De Nova, who many will know is a stalwart ISSP person. But any reflections on that? How do you manage that when you're trying to do the whole thing online? How do you manage the selection of a person to actually
we had specific questions that they were supposed to answer first. That something along the lines of, we're trying to select the person with between ages of 18 and 59. Are you that age group? And that made it also difficult because we had a lot of what we call dead weight people who are older who weren't eligible to participate in the survey. So we asked that specific question and we said, are you the person in your household who has their next birthday? Yes, no. And a lot of people said no, and then they dropped out. So we lost people in that stage as well because their partner didn't want to answer the survey. So we tried to do something about it, but it also ended up in fewer people participating in the survey from that particular household, or nobody from that particular household.
Right, thank you.
I think just to go back to Lilia's question, we know that not all of them are the right. So if you use the next birthday approach, not all of them will be the right people. There will be a proportion of them that are not. I can't, looking at Roxandra, don't know if you remember the proportion.
But there's also been conclusions, right? There's people that, might have had, we have unchecked for sure, know if they had the last birthday or not, if their birthday is in the same month of the completion of the questionnaire, or if they have the same partner, the household. So there's a lot of big conclusions that we're actually unsure whether it's the right person or not. So that's not the thing. But actually incorrect, that we know for sure incorrect is talking about
Also, this is an interesting question. I wonder how much is known about how well this used to work in face-to-face surveys. I mean, interviewers went to the door and said, who's got the next birthday? They didn't check that, right? So I think it's not clear that it's like going from perfect to bad, right? But there is.
Well, sorry, to be fair, I don't think face-to-face rely much on that telephone that used next birthday. Face-to-face used to numerate. They would have some means of saying, can you list the people?
The history.
They did it.
Alphabetical by first name.
They did in the UK, but not in all other countries. Some of them did use next birthday.
So we're out of time, but I could see there was a question with Alan, and I've got a lovely question online that I'm going to finish with. So Alan, do you want to go first?
Change back a bit, yeah, that's what you said at the beginning. You used the word getting more people involved. I'm interested in what people we're talking about. So far, we've talked about people being users, mainly academics and policymakers. I'm thinking, yeah, okay, so far, but I'd like to go a bit further and get Joe Public. So that, and I think there are creative ways in which we can do it. To get Joe Public. Because we often survey, 3,000, 5,000 people in a nation, but we don't go beyond. I think there are creative. I think the way to do that is to move away from surveys and to start talking about quizzes. Now, I use quizzes on purpose because it's very different. And the idea is to take a small sample of those questions that are in surveys and actually make a quiz. And actually then you can use that, you can get a lot of traction, a lot of people involved. My sins I've done one, howgoodmanagement.com, that on the train. Over 85% of people have been on their mobile phone, still a minute. So howgoodwasmyjob.com. You can really get traction. And there's fantastic opportunities to get traction with such a quiz. One, you can extend it to, in my case, over 100,000 people at very low cost. You can also signpost those people to the reports that we talked about, Rory and Bobby talked about. You can also embed within it change behaviour aspect. I did one with 2 trade unions that actually, if they weren't a member of trade unions, signposted people to a trade union's sign up. So we can be more creative, and I'm extending your phrase, Alison, people to include Joe Public. I think there are ways in which we can do it. I think there are creative ways in which we can do it, and we have the infrastructure. These 4 surveys are classic to do it. It just needs that kind of willingness to do so. It would be very country specific, but I don't think that's no bad thing. And there are kind of models out there about how we might do it. The data you get back is very skewed and certainly not pristine, nothing like the kind of stuff. But it has another role. Its role is to extend reach and to engage more people, and particularly Joe Public, which is, to be honest, as an academic community, I think we are all academic. We might get an article in the Times or the Observer or those quality newspapers. We don't really reach Joe Public, but I think there are ways to.
So there's a great challenge there from Alan. Do any of you want to bite on that or reflect?
I think that the idea of making service more appealing is definitely a good idea. I have to admit that GGS is a very long-form survey, and we don't know what to do with that, because the point is that we have to get detailed information about individuals in order to be able to do scientific analyses or an association between different variables. So the type of survey that you're describing and the type of exercise that you're describing misses out a lot of the very important demographics detail that you need in order to be able to do high quality analysis. The other issue is, of course, that it doesn't have sampling anymore. If we were to incorporate something that was more fun into a sampling framework, that could be definitely a way to go forward. And we've discussed within the GPP with more follow-up, more interesting quizzes, if you like. And I definitely think that there's scope for being more creative with gamification or something like that to try to get people more involved. And there are the German survey is annually interviewing people with different types of questions. So there is room for that, but I think that it's important that it stays within a sampling framework so that we can apply weights and understand how it is representative. And also, in some cases, we do need this more detailed information.
What I'm saying is it's additional to.
Yeah.
It
sounds like a really good discussion to have over a coffee or a drink at the next with the refreshments outside. Did you want to come in on that?
Just one thing, I agree with you, and I think it's a good challenge for all of us to think about. One exciting thing we are doing in a new project we've got is we're developing tools to engage school children and others with ESS data. It's something that our colleagues at the European Value Study have done with their e-values tool, and we're repurposing that to use data from different surveys, including ESS and GGP actually, to make that a tool to use in schools to engage children with that. So I think more of that. I don't know, you could have a little thing, people come and try and guess 5 statistics from our surveys, and they fill that in, and then it shows them the data. Maybe that's all you're thinking about.
Ways of engaging more people.
Yeah, which is really, really, really important. So let's, I'm going to ask one final question, which is from people listening online. So I'm going to tweak it slightly. So it references Margaret Thatcher's response to the sexual behaviour questions that were going to be on the National Study of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles back in the 80s, for those of you who are around then. And the idea that certain topics are just too controversial to be asked about. And I suppose I think the question is interested in your experience working on these international studies. Are there certain topics that are just too controversial, or I'd extend difficult to ask about in a kind of cross-national context? So Natalie, do you want to? I appreciate you've not worked on ISSP
as long, but I think experience of ISSP has just been very sensitive to country context. So I think it's another question that potentially might see more in one country, potentially very sensitive to other. Similar experience on ESS as well. I think those issues around translation. So ISSP is written in English and then translated in terms that can feel feel fine in one language. Can
Yeah.
potentially cover
Yeah.
another.
No,
So
that's
maybe less around topics and more around experience. So what's appropriate to country context? Thinking carefully about translation.
that's really important. Rory, any reflections from you on that?
I guess top something like sexual lifestyles that I think works well as a standalone study. I don't think it would necessarily fit well to suddenly pop that into BSA or ESS because I think it needs proper introduction and things like that. We haven't really come across, I think, many topics that you can't ask about at all at the European level, but I think it becomes much more difficult for the ISSPs and the World Value Survey because then you've got many more different contexts to do.
Brilliant. Brianna.
Yeah, we had this discussion in this module committee selection, the selection committee. Because one of the questions that was proposed was simply, what is your sexual identity? And our Polish colleague said, this isn't going to work in Poland. You can't, and I was surprised. And because it's often important to ask these questions before there's a higher degree of tolerance. But we made the question optional, depending on the country, because in some countries you simply can't ask what is your sexual identity, sexual orientation. So that was one that just came up recently as being more sensitive than I would have expected.
Great, thank you. In that case, let's draw this to a close. A massive thank you to our three speakers here and to Bobby, who was here earlier on, for your contributions to this. Thanks so much to everybody in the room and everybody participating online. It's been a really stimulating conversation. And those of you who are here in the room, there's refreshments outside. Thank you.